Who do you think are the Russian oligarchs?
They basically took over government and were running the state.
They contributed in a way to Putin's political regime.
They are anti-Putin oligarchs.
Vladimir, you're ruining my life in the West. Please don't do this.
And it took the UK quite a while to put any proper oligarch on the list.
Hi everyone, my name is Andre. Welcome to another episode of our video podcast about things, and thank you very much for tuning in. If you are currently listening to an audio version of this podcast, please make sure you check out our YouTube channel as well. It's About Things podcast. If you are currently watching this on YouTube, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing and liking this video. It really helps a lot and would be massively appreciated. Anyway, our guest today is Elisabeth Schimpfössl, a senior lecturer in sociology and policy at Aston University, and the author of a great book called Rich Russians: From Oligarchs to Bourgeoisie. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
In the recent months, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of talk about the so-called Russian oligarchs. And I find this term a little tricky, as it may potentially have a lot of different meanings, and it has also probably evolved quite a lot over time since the 1990s. Since you've literally written a book about them, who do you think are the Russian oligarchs, and what does that term even mean?
It's a very fair question, because I myself, it's now 2.5 months ago that I was completely puzzled about all of a sudden the whole world, especially also world leaders from Biden to Johnson to the EU, talking about oligarchs. And if you look back the last 15 at least years before, the term would maximum appear on a tabloid headline. But if you look at, and I did it, tried it out recently, to find a book title that has oligarch on it and was on Russia, the term had completely disappeared. And I remember myself when I started my PhD, it was 2007, then I was told you can't call those people oligarchs because it's not a term that is academically suitable anymore, and not a term that is correct in order to describe what we see in Russia in the 2000s when we talk about the super rich. The term Russian oligarch, historically by academics, has been ascribed, by academics when it comes to Russia, not in general, completely different story, to those who made money overnight in the privatizations, auctions in the mid-90s. And what it came to then afterwards was what is called an oligarchic state capture in academic terms. They basically took over government and were running the state. Yeltsin was incapacitated, and they were very keen to keep the fortunes they had just made overnight very easily. So when Putin came to power, he tamed the oligarchs very quickly. He sent the media tycoons out of the country, and then had his big attack against Khodorkovsky, which ended him spending 10 years in a Siberian prison camp. And from that point onwards, the academic world, scholarship working on Russia, decided we can't call them oligarchs anymore, which is a big mistake, because and that's also the thing, actually the term has changed over an endless long time, not the last few years, but in the course of the 20th century, from this idea that it's, the original idea is that it is wealthy people who use the resources in order to protect their wealth. Doesn't mean that they need to rule. Anyway, so long story short, if we look at Russian oligarchs in particular, it is by and large the people who came out of the 1990s. There, of course, then appeared new ones in the 2000s and tried, as an oligarch does, increase their fortunes, increase their wealth by trying to influence politics. And they kept doing so in many ways also in the 2000s, and they did extremely well in many ways. So in the 2000s, we've got the idea that it was the end of the oligarchs. It wasn't at all. If we look at, of course, I mean, Putin had to tame them in order to make things work at great cost to a few individuals, but otherwise, it was a golden era for the super rich in Russia. So what Putin did in 2001 is introduced a flat tax of 13%, and the flat tax is basically the hyper symbol of neoliberal policy, of course, completely to their favor. And then also the privatizations that followed in the course of the 2000s were massively bigger than the scandalous ones that went into history from the 1990s. And as a result, the oligarchs became richer and richer to an extent that it was in 2013 Credit Suisse started publishing annual wealth reports. And the one from 2013 said they don't know what to do with Russia because wealth inequality had reached such an extreme that, so they had 4 different categories where they put different countries in terms of level of wealth inequality, and Russia was just so far outside that they were thinking, well, do we need to introduce a new category? So that's not so mixed up. And when people hear that, they get confused sometimes with social inequality, income inequality, as we traditionally describe it. But when we look at income levels and inequality, of course, it's a completely different story to what we have now, where wealth inequality has run far ahead in terms of its levels. So it's pretty good to be in Russia and have billions, more lucrative than in other countries in many ways. They have interesting data from Bloomberg, I believe. In 2005, if you were on the Forbes list in Russia, you had a 96% chance to be still on the Forbes list 5 years later. If you were in the G7 countries, it was only 75%. So it's not too bad to be a Russian oligarch in that sense.
But is it just as long as they do not try? As far as I remember, the whole point of this change with Putin in the 2000s was, at least this is what is often cited, is this weird social contract or whatever it is called, that Putin basically told them, okay, you can keep all those riches and you can continue to prosper, just do not intrude in politics, in my policies. Is that the case?
Oh, yeah, of course. But if you look at, I mean, Khodorkovsky was a bit too rebellious. But if you look at oligarch interests, many of them are politically active and actually quite outspoken when it comes to advocating their own or pushing their own economic reform ideas and policies. But they don't, I mean, they might not be exactly Kremlin narrative, but they don't contradict it either. So unless you had an idea to speak out for things that contradict the Kremlin, you could also be quite outspoken in what you want. We've got, for example, Prokhorov, who has, I mean, many of them have that. That's also a basic idea of this is also important in terms of oligarchy. Oligarchy doesn't need authoritarian tendencies or populism in order to grow. We can have oligarchies in liberal democracies like the US. What is a precondition for oligarchs to rise is inequality. And of course, because that's basically their oxygen, they do all they can to fight any regulations or laws that could decrease inequality. And in that sense, the oligarchs in Russia are pretty good. Prokhorov, for example, was pushing quite hard for complete privatization of everything, education, medicine, and all kind of public services, which is very much in line with Russian tradition anyway. For example, Piotr Aven, who was now under sanctions, who was as part of the government in the early 90s, and many others of the time, they are disciples of reforms, as we they're kind of they're very outspoken about it too, of reforms of the sort Pinochet introduced in Chile after 1973. So basically, no states. It's kind of the Friedman type,
right wing,
very extreme of neoliberalism, and that goes so far also to, for example, when Putin came to power, Aven tried to encourage him to take more dictatorial measures, introduce more dictatorial measures in order to be able to push through reforms of the type, Chilean type reforms along the example of Pinochet. And the idea behind it is, if capitalism flourishes, if private entrepreneurialism has basically complete freedom, then they will, in our words, for example, they will then look after the rest through philanthropy. So no state anymore at all, and everything, the prosperity of capitalism will then make everything else fall in place.
So would you say that all these people who, for example, Aven that you've mentioned, now these days reside in London, they contributed in a way to the political regime that is now currently in Russia, Putin's political regime?
Indirectly, yes, of course. And one person who can clearly see that already for years is someone like Khodorkovsky, who after his 10 years in Siberia started thinking about it, reflecting, and said, well, yes, we should have probably in the 1990s looked over or thought about the population in general a bit more carefully, and the impact it has, what we do on living standards, employment, basic infrastructure. And had we done that, then probably Putin wouldn't exist. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, he was the only one who spent 10 years in a prison camp, so the others don't think that way.
Well, the reason why I'm asking about this responsibility is basically because of the sanctions that I wanted to discuss with you. So, once again, all these wealthy Russian individuals, they have been very much at the forefront of Western media reporting during the war in Ukraine. And the main reason for that was that almost entire Russia's Forbes list is now basically sanctioned by various jurisdictions such as the US, the UK.
I wish, but did you?
I mean, okay, but a lot of people that you probably wouldn't expect necessarily
that is true, yeah.
to become included to become included in those lists. And while it includes individuals that have been widely perceived to be affiliated with President Putin or even holding assets on his behalf, other people seem to not have necessarily benefited that much, let's say, from the current Russian political system or whatever. As example of that, I thought of Oleg Tinkov, for example. Do you think sanctioning all these individuals almost indiscriminately is an effective way, basically, to pressure?
Well, I agree with you that some choices were a bit peculiar, but it's actually the other way around, I would say. So, if we go back to the 24th of February, so 2 days before the invasion, many countries announcing their first sanctions, including the British government. What Johnson did is he announced 3 individuals to put on the individual sanction list. That were 2 Rothenbergs and Timchenko. And the week before, Russian oligarchs here had been running around lobbying political institutions and within the establishment not to fall onto the sanction list. I was kind of angry when I heard these three names because it was basically non-sanctions. None of the three is any active in the UK, so won't hurt them too much. And what I still think up to now, it was exactly the time had a critical mass of oligarchs of the sort who are hanging around here a lot fallen on the sanction list. They might have pooled forces and maybe first knocked on Putin's door and begged him not to do something crazy, or otherwise used other pressure tools they have at hand. So the Rothenbergs also were there's a clear thing where all EU, US and Britain went down a route that is hugely ineffective. So Arkady Rothenberg, the richest of them was judo training mate of Putin's, and got rich through this friendship and nothing else. So if Rothenberg is stuck in Russia, it will annoy him, and well, the whole family, but it's not actually such a big deal. And sanctions, after all, are a tool that should have an impact. So if the whole economy of Iran is affected by sanctions, we don't care about that. Well, it doesn't quite... it's not quite fair to the peasants somewhere in a village. What could they have done differently? Or it might even hit those who have always fought against the regime. So sanctions are a tool where it's not about... And that's also a bit an irony. We start thinking about, is it fair on them or not? When it comes to the super rich, we don't think so much about it when it comes, to the peasant in some village. Then we accept it very happily. So there's a certain hypocrisy behind it. But the important thing is, if you want to make sanctions effective, then it needs to hit people. So if we think about the oligarchs who hang around here and who also needs to hang around here or have this second home somewhere in the West, then it is people who exactly those like an Avon, like a Friedman, like all the kind of oligarchs who came up in the 1990s who appeared prior to a time when anybody here of us would have ever heard of the name Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So they are also those Putin had to tame when he came to power. So they are also those who, of course, agreed to get along with Putin and play the game, but it's also those who've never kind of lost a certain fear of maybe when Putin is doing a taming exercise, whether it might hit them or not. So for them it's extremely important to not be stuck in Russia and fully at the Kremlin's mercy, but to be able to, anytime when they have to, when they're threatened by prosecution, have this second life in the West. So I think had it hit a certain critical mass of oligarchs right from the start, things... it would have contributed to potentially things running differently. The third, of course, the UK, when London is money laundering capital of the West. So when Johnson announced those three names, it sounded pretty much like, oh guys, you all around here, we really like you, we've liked you for years. We like your money, let's keep it that way. And it took the UK quite a while to put any proper oligarch on the list. And they would have, it wasn't possible to not touch Abramovich in the end, but he's the best connected oligarch around here. They didn't want to. It wasn't in their interest. So why? But there's also this whole huge industry, service industry in the UK that caters for those people, that has long prospered from the money of those people, and it's not in their interest to cut into their own flesh and have these money flows stop. It's strange choice, come back to your question of some of the people they chose. But if you look at the, let's say, 31st names on the Forbes list, the Russian Forbes list, there are so many missing.
Okay.
Let's take, for example, any textbook on Russia, any politics introduction book, textbook, you will certainly find the name Putin. Putin is the one who, when there were the big privatization auctions in the 90s, who designed this scheme, made sure that he would benefit from it generously. And he was then also the one right in the middle of this oligarchic state capture. So you open any textbook and you find his name. He's been on and off the richest person in Russia. He's now the richest person. The Canadians sanctioned him, but otherwise no one for some reason. But then one of the first names, a week before Tinkoff ended on the list. And Tinkoff is one of the few who... He isn't all that rich. So once you have billions in Russia, you cannot not dance around the Kremlin and schmooze with the Kremlin and have harmonic relations. So when Friedman says that, he's not met Putin for ages, and maybe he hasn't met Putin for ages because Putin has been in the bunker and hasn't hardly seen anyone. Abramovich, the same, and Abramovich, he hasn't maybe had direct access because Putin was in the bunker. But if Abramovich wants to pass on something to Putin, he can obviously find ways to do so. Tinkoff is odd because he's one of the very few, but he's also poorer. But one of the very few who, he never participated in privatizations. He made his money with pelmeni and vodka and beer. And he's bumped into Putin once, I think it was in 2001, by chance in one of his restaurants, but he's one of the very few who is completely different story. But a week before, the name that appeared on the UK sanction list was Moshkovich. Moshkovich is in this book. Moshkovich, you've never heard of?
I've heard about him.
Oh, really?
Sugar, isn't it?
Agriculture, yeah. Oh, interesting. And he's never played a big role. He got big after the 2014 sanctions because his business was agriculture, and Russia tried to be more self-contained in food production. And lucky timing, and he got, I think, from 1 billion or less up to near to 4 billion. But it was kind of oddest choice. So many of the first 30 on the Forbes list are completely missing, and then they get to, as if they kind of closed their eyes and pointed to someone, or they know something
that we don't
I have
know.
no idea about. But yeah, I'd love to be a fly on the wall during those meetings where they decide who they put on the list.
So maybe just to come back to those sanctions and their purpose in the first place, because you said maybe if all those sanctions were introduced from the beginning in 2014, things maybe would have been different and much more effective as well. So in what way they would be effective in terms of what the West expects these people to go and like speak to Putin, try to persuade him, to not go to Ukraine, like, look, Vladimir, you're ruining my life in the West, please don't do this. Or basically, are they expecting some sort of a crack within the political elite in Russia? What's the purpose, and why would it be effective at all to sanction these people?
Putin's been in power for so long because he's been seen as one who, and the only one who is able to, or was able to balance out the interests of the various elite groups. And the oligarchs are obviously one of those elite groups. So there's a problem if he loses the loyalty and faith of a whole elite group. And there's a certain, well, on the first hand, of course, in every crisis situation, for example, 2014, Putin orders the 30 richest men into Kremlin and gives them Andrei Petrovich, we look after that infrastructure thing, 20 million, and and so on. And of course, there are open wallets, but that's not that important when you sit on oil and so many countries are dependent on you. But that's a bit more problematic. There are massive employers. For example, Deripaska has about 70 or 80,000 people employed in Russia. Then you have all this they're often kind of concentrating in certain towns where there are production sites. And the last thing, and Kremlin is very, very, very aware about that, and also very sensitive about that, is the last thing they need is social unrest. They don't mind so much about some middle-class liberals in the big cities, but this kind of proper on-the-ground unrest or discontent bursting out in among kind of ordinary people, they know that can travel, have a domino effect, and get really dangerous. So if you have then all of a sudden big unemployment, people on the street because an oligarch is disappearing, that's not ideal. But the biggest impact they could potentially have is, and they've been around for so long, they have ideal connections and influence. And they also have the advantage, it's almost kind of advantage out of the disadvantage, that they are not so close to Putin now and remote from the kind of inner circle without necessarily direct access. Then they have much more freedom to plot. So if kind of at first days, I mean, I wasn't the only one who was thinking, so maybe, I mean, they're pretty good in introducing premature heart attacks and stuff. So surely the leadership and the top military and secret service elites, they know inside out how to do that. So maybe they could, especially if it was beneficial for someone who wants to step into Putin's position, maybe they want to also, when they see Putin is causing such chaos, also consider doing something similar in relation to him. But the problem is Shoigu, defense minister, and the foreign minister Lavrov, they can't meet in a park on a park bench. They're under observation. They can't. Plotting is difficult for them, but oligarchs easily could. So, and they would also have the tools and potential to bring about a regime change, which they see as more in their favor as what we have now. The problem is, and that's why I'm also saying there should have been a critical mass sanction right from the start. Oligarchs are not kind of, they're not the best in collaborating among each other. They're all rivals. They're all used to also stabbing each other in the back. They don't have their union tradition.
Isn't that Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs?
Yeah, but I think that the kind of traditions and kind of what they learn in there in terms of working together in that sense is not so elaborate. And if you go step by step, as the West has done it so far, then you see every single person trying to sneak their own way out, rather them as a group finally kind of thinking, okay, that war is not in our interests. It's messing up with our fortunes. It's messing up with our individual lives. and we can see when these random choices of who gets sanctions, it could maybe mess up a lot. So maybe we want to pool forces for once and work together. And what is important there, then exactly the kind of the leeway they have to push for it, of course, could make a massive difference if they worked out strategies of how to influence the leadership. But now it's too late. So now we've got, for example, Abramovich is a classical example, having found his own super joker by playing his important role in negotiations. So everybody's finding an individual way out, which is completely the opposite of making them work together and push for something different.
Despite the fact that we say, that these very wealthy Russian individuals or oligarchs, they are all quite dependent on Putin's regime and on Russia in general, we have still seen a couple of them speaking out. I mean, it was to varying extent, of course. There was Oleg Deripaska, I think, who criticized the war, but made sure he does not say anything bad about Putin or the government. He just said, economically this is terrible. This is going to take us back to the 1990s. And when I say this, I mean the war in Ukraine. Then Mikhail Friedman, I think, mentioned something like that he was born in Ukraine and, these issues shouldn't be solved in this manner, etc. And then I think the most, I was going to say aggressive, but I will say honest comment was given by Oleg Tinkov, who actually went sort of after the Russian army and in a way insulted the Russian generals or Russian army in general, calling it shit, as far as I understand, or as far as I remember. So there still are people who speak out against the war in Ukraine. Why do you think there's still not that many of them?
Even the cases you mentioned, not Tinkov, that's different. But Friedman and Deripaska, if you look at them closely, Deripaska found that quite curious. I'm subscribed to his Telegram channel, and the first comment he made was, there should be no war, we need peace. So, except for the word war, Putin could have said, Putin can't say war because there's no war and the term as such is cancelled. But otherwise it could have been Putin as well saying the same. Of course, if we need peace, he can easily say. That's why he's gone for the war in the first place, according to his logic. But if you look at Deripaska, it was quite curious. The West were all over him, almost glorifying him. And that is very much something we see a lot, this kind of urge in the West of singling out the good ones and finding the white sheep among the black. But if we then look further, his comments were quite bizarre. He went silent after that for about 3 days. And then not shortly after, he posted something about we need to be very alert, it's very dangerous, we need to be aware that Ukraine has a massive nuclear arsenal. So it was it was very clear he's trying to be very careful and not offend anybody. Okay. Also, keep the Kremlin in appeased. Something, it's obviously, if they want to save their skin, and also when it comes to the children of the oligarchs, Sophie Abramovich's daughter, who pictured herself in a Baywatch type swimming suits and spoke against war. Of course, the children are so much. They can't lose their everything in the West because there's so much more. The whole lifestyle, the whole future is so much more intertwined with it. If they want to save their skin, and they've got to be anti-war if they want to have any future here. So we see not necessarily been asked sometimes whether the children are much more progressive. I think it's very pragmatic for them in the first place to speak out against war. But in general, we don't see all that many. And even Tinkoff, no blame on him, but nevertheless he spoke out only after he'd fallen on the sanction list and not beforehand. And I've also sometimes been asked about whether they are anti-Putin oligarchs. Well, there are anti-Putin oligarchs, but you will have trouble to find a single person among them who is still in the Kremlin's good books and at the same time starting to speak out against the Kremlin. So it's only after they've already fallen out with him that they start speaking out. And that is a good reason, because if we look at the rich Russians in general, they need Russia in order to make money. It's where the money flows. During my research and interviews, they remember one case I asked, it was actually the wife of a billionaire, what it was that her parents had passed on to her that made her become that successful. And her answer was, Elisabeth, of course, what they passed on to me is genes. So this idea of superior genes that made them just right from the start more intelligent, more innovative, more entrepreneurial. So they also have kind of an idea of an entrepreneurial gene, a superior one, which determines their success. Of course, it also needs to be combined with hard work. It's not only good genes, but also meritocratic efforts that have made them rise. But there's a bit of problem with this entrepreneurial gene, the super genes they think they have. It's never traveled across the border of Russia. So you don't have a single oligarch who has ever managed to replicate or make use of their super gene once they are outside Russia. Which also means when some of the oligarchs like Friedman say, well, they've made everything by themselves, it's their life works, it's their hard work. That's a bit something to be careful about and question. It's people who made their big money in Russia at a certain time, they were at a certain age. Many of them were not rags to riches stories. Tinkoff is an exception to that. His father was a miner. But they were born into quite privileged circumstances and went to very good universities and were in many ways pretty lucky. But admitting that the success is down to luck is something they never do. So this idea of superiority is very, very deeply anchored in their minds, but not something we see otherwise. That's also why, for example, London has become the destination number one for them to live, because it allows to commute easily to Moscow. So you have a lot of those people for years on end already to commute during the week, have their families here, and the children at very good boarding schools, and continue making their money in Russia.
Well, Elisabeth, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate your time today. But before we finish, there is always one question that I ask every single guest before the end of the podcast, and that is, if there was one thing in the world that you could change, what would it be?
I would think that we shouldn't have oligarchic power, which would mean changing the whole world around, and not only in Russia but everywhere.
You mean inequality, addressing inequalities, or?
Yeah, but that won't work if, as we have it here, let's take everywhere. Elon Musk, Rees-Mogg, and all these people who also make or have the freedom to make laws and regulations, or Musk with his money influencing them. Yes, that would mean basically pretty much a revolution if we wanted not to have them rule the world, and therefore oligarchic power decrease.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about Elon Musk buying Twitter, actually? Now that we're talking about, what do you think about
Well, it's a tricky question, because on the one hand, I'm very much aligning with him in terms of freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. And I think, for example, when it comes to the pandemic, not allowing for fears, anxieties, doubts to be discussed was a big mistake, because it brought polarization and almost a fundamentalist camp building in society, which is extremely dangerous for democracy. So on the one hand, I'm fully with Musk. On the other hand, it's so clear that, I mean, he's a textbook case of someone who, with his influence, doesn't care about the consequences. He a classical case of any regulation that would decrease the gap between rich and poor is absolutely something he's fighting to the end. And also now it would have been more correct, for example, when he started making fun of some of the Twitter executives, and that was then answered by a big wave of racism, because of some of them of a non-white ethnic background. Had he followed up on his kind of moral high ground of freedom of speech, he would have also had the responsibility of saying, well, that's not what I meant. Everybody can speak out, but you racists, you go away. And he didn't do that. So he, I think, is quite a dangerous figure after all. Mm-hmm. And it's also kind of interesting in terms of the whole tech elite, the influence they have. I mean, it's oligarchs par excellence. And there's almost a bit something racist in... So now this kind of Russian oligarchs are back, and it's Russian oligarchs. And it's very useful also for other countries that their super rich are not oligarchs, because oligarchs are basically Russian. You have this combination of super wealth and nationality assigned to it. Of course, it distracts the world from evil elsewhere, and the tech industry not being regulated. Of course, I mean, if you just look at how their individual decisions, we depend on them after storming of Capitol, Dorsey deciding that Trump's Twitter account must be closed. Mm-hmm. And the states and democratic structures being completely outside all these decision-making processes. And I don't think an individual sitting on this massive mountain of wealth should be someone we depend on. And that's individual decisions. And when it comes to Elon Musk, then it doesn't look good for us at all.
Great. Thank you very much for this. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.